The bus rattled through the gates of Fort Whitfield just as the morning sun crested the Georgia pines, casting long shadows across the parade ground where soldiers moved in precise formations. Staff Sergeant Cordelia Ashworth Pemberton watched through the dust-streaked window, her reflection a ghost against the passing landscape. She had requested this assignment specifically because no one here would know her name. No one would snap to attention at the mention of her father. No one would treat her differently because her grandfather's portrait hung in the Hall of Heroes at the Pentagon. She stepped off the bus carrying a single duffel bag, her uniform crisp but deliberately unmarked by the ribbon she had earned the right to wear. 3 combat deployments, a Silver Star she never spoke about, 2 Bronze Stars with Valor devices that sat in a box beneath her bed at her mother's house in Virginia. Today, she was just another staff sergeant reporting for duty, and that was exactly how she wanted it. Before we continue with Cordelia's story, take a moment to drop a comment and let us know what state or country you are watching from tonight. Perhaps you have military families in your community, or maybe you have served yourself. Wherever you are, we are grateful you're here with us. The processing center smelled of floor wax and old coffee. Cordelia handed her transfer orders to a specialist who barely glanced at them before pointing her toward a plastic chair against the wall. She sat and waited, watching other soldiers come and go, listening to the rhythm of a place that would become her home for the next 2 years. A commotion near the door drew her attention. A thick-necked sergeant first class strode through the processing center like he owned every square inch of it, his voice booming as he berated a young private for some invisible offense. The private stood trembling, eyes fixed on a point beyond the sergeant's shoulder, absorbing the verbal assault without response. "That is Sergeant First Class Huxley," a specialist whispered to the soldier beside him, not realizing Cordelia could hear. "They call him Bull. You do not want to end up in his company." Cordelia studied the man they called Bull. She had known sergeants like him throughout her career. Men who confuse volume with leadership and intimidation with respect. Men who built their authority on fear rather than competence. She had served under commanders who would have ended such behavior in an instant, her father chief among them. But she was not here to change anyone. She was here to serve quietly, to prove to herself that she could succeed without the weight of her family name clearing her path. The specialist processing her paperwork returned with a folder and a room assignment. He also handed her a company designation that made her stomach tighten. "Bravo Company," he said. "You will report to Sergeant First Class Huxley at 0500 tomorrow." Cordelia accepted the paperwork with a neutral expression. "Thank you, Specialist." She gathered her duffel and walked toward the barracks, passing beneath a memorial arch dedicated to soldiers who had given everything in service to their nation. Her grandfather's name was not listed here. His sacrifice had come on a different battlefield, in a different war, but the weight of it followed her still. Her room was small and sparse, a single bed and a metal locker, a window overlooking the training fields where tomorrow she would begin again. She unpacked methodically, placing her few personal items in the locker with military precision. At the bottom of her duffel, wrapped in a soft cloth, was a photograph she allowed herself to keep. Her grandfather in his dress uniform, taken the week before he deployed to Vietnam for the last time. He was smiling, unaware that he would soon throw himself on a grenade to save 6 members of his squad. Cordelia traced the edge of the frame with her finger. She had joined the army to honor him, not to ride the coattails of his legend or her father's rank. Every ribbon she had earned, every commendation, every moment of valor had come because she refused to be anything less than worthy of the name she carried. Tomorrow she would meet Sergeant First Class Huxley, and he would see only what she allowed him to see. A quiet staff sergeant with a classified service record and no interest in making waves. He would never suspect that the woman standing in his formation had held a defensive position alone for 9 hours against overwhelming enemy forces. He would never know that 4-star generals called her father for advice, or that her tactical assessments had shaped operations at the highest levels. She set the photograph in her locker and closed the door. Let him underestimate her. She had nothing to prove to men like him. But somewhere in the back of her mind, a voice that sounded remarkably like her grandfather's whispered a warning. Pride comes before the fall, Delia. And sometimes the fall comes for everyone involved. The morning air bit cold against exposed skin as Bravo Company assembled on the training field at 0500. Cordelia stood in formation among soldiers half her age, most of them fresh from basic training and still learning the rhythm of military life. She kept her eyes forward and her posture perfect, blending into the ranks like a shadow. Sergeant First Class Huxley arrived exactly on time, his boots striking the pavement with the deliberate cadence of a man who wanted his presence felt before it was seen. He walked the length of the formation slowly, inspecting each soldier with eyes that seemed designed to find fault. When he reached Cordelia, he paused. "Staff Sergeant Ashworth Pemberton," he said, reading from a clipboard. "Transferred in from where exactly?" Cordelia kept her gaze fixed on the horizon. "Fort Bragg, Sergeant." Huxley made a sound in his throat that conveyed neither approval nor disapproval. He moved on without further comment, but she could feel his attention lingering on her like a weight. The first exercise was a 5-mile run through terrain that shifted between paved roads and muddy trails. Huxley set a punishing pace at the front, and soldiers began falling behind within the first mile. Cordelia maintained her position in the middle of the pack, careful not to pull ahead despite the fact that her body was conditioned for distances 3 times as long. She had learned years ago that excellence invited scrutiny, and scrutiny invited questions she did not want to answer. A young private near her stumbled on a root and went down hard, her ankle twisting beneath her. Cordelia stopped immediately and knelt beside her. "Private Fremont," she said, reading the name tape on the soldier's uniform. "Can you put weight on it?" The private's face was pale with pain and something else. "Fear. I cannot fall out," she whispered. "He will destroy me if I fall out." Cordelia understood without asking who she meant. She helped Fremont to her feet and supported her weight as they continued moving. They fell to the back of the formation, but they did not stop. By the time they crossed the finish line, Huxley was already screaming at the soldiers who had dropped out entirely. His eyes found Cordelia and Fremont limping in together, and his expression twisted into something between contempt and curiosity. He said nothing, but Cordelia knew she had just painted a target on her back. The remainder of the morning passed in a blur of exercises designed more to break spirits than build strength. Huxley's methods were crude, but effective in their cruelty. He identified the weakest members of the company and focused his attention on them with surgical precision, stripping away their confidence layer by layer. Cordelia watched and remembered a different kind of leadership. Her father had commanded tens of thousands of soldiers, and he had done it by building them up rather than tearing them down. He believed that a leader's job was to make every person under their command better than they thought they could be. Huxley believed the opposite. He wanted soldiers who were afraid, because afraid soldiers did not question orders. During the lunch break, a specialist with kind eyes and an easy smile approached Cordelia as she sat alone eating a protein bar. He dropped onto the bench across from her without invitation. "Specialist Darnell Hitchens," he said, "I saw what you did for Fremont this morning. That was decent of you." Cordelia shrugged. She needed help. Hitchens leaned closer and lowered his voice. "Word of advice, Staff Sergeant. Huxley does not like decent. He does not like soldiers who help each other. He wants everyone so focused on their own survival that they would sell out their own mother to avoid his attention." "I appreciate the warning," Cordelia said. Hitchens studied her for a moment. "You're not scared of him, are you?" It was not really a question, but Cordelia answered anyway. "I have seen worse things than angry sergeants, specialist." Something flickered in Hitchens's eyes. Respect, maybe, or recognition of a kindred spirit. He nodded slowly and stood to leave. "Just be careful." The last soldier who stood up to him got transferred to Alaska. The one before that got drummed out on fabricated charges. "He has connections." Cordelia filed that information away and finished her meal in silence. The afternoon brought rifle drills on the parade ground, where Huxley's voice echoed off the buildings like thunder. He corrected form with shoves and slaps to helmets, Physical contact that skirted the edge of acceptable but never quite crossed into territory that would trigger official consequences. When he reached Cordelia, he stopped and watched her execute each movement with textbook precision. Her hands moved through the drill with the fluid memory of someone who had performed these actions thousands of times, in training and in combat, under fire and under pressure that Huxley could not imagine. His jaw tightened. "What did you say you served, Staff Sergeant?" "I did not say Sergeant." The silence stretched between them. Huxley was accustomed to soldiers who cowered, who stammered, who gave him whatever he wanted to make the pressure stop. Cordelia simply waited, her rifle held at perfect rest, her eyes calm and unreadable. Huxley stepped closer, close enough that she could smell the coffee on his breath. "I'm going to find out who you are," he said quietly. "And when I do, we're going to have a very different conversation." Cordelia did not blink. "I'll look forward to it, Sergeant." He moved on, but she could feel the fury radiating from him like heat from a furnace. She had made an enemy today, and she had done it simply by refusing to be afraid. In her experience, that was the one thing men like Huxley could never forgive. 3 days passed, and Huxley's obsession with Cordelia grew like a tumor. He had pulled her service record from the battalion personnel office, expecting to find ammunition he could use against her. Instead, he found pages marked with classification levels that exceeded his clearance, black redaction bars covering entire sections, and references to units whose names he did not recognize. This only made him angrier. He stood in his office on the 4th morning, the thin folder open on his desk, speaking to the personnel specialist who had retrieved it. "What do you mean you cannot get me more information?" he demanded. The specialist shifted uncomfortably. "Sergeant, those classification levels require authorization from theater command at minimum. Some of those markings I have never even seen before. Whatever she did, whoever she worked for, is way above my pay grade." Huxley dismissed him with a wave and stared at the folder. A staff sergeant with a record locked tighter than most generals. It made no sense. She was nobody, just another female soldier who had somehow talked her way into assignments she did not deserve. He was certain of it. On the training field that afternoon, he began his campaign in earnest. "Ashworth Pemberton," he bellowed across the parade ground. Front and center. Cordelia jogged to position and stood at attention before him. The rest of Bravo Company watched from their formation, sensing blood in the water. "Your records say you have combat deployments," Huxley said, loudly enough for everyone to hear. "3 of them. But I cannot seem to find any details about what you actually did over there. Care to enlighten me?" Cordelia kept her eyes forward. "My service record speaks for itself, Sergeant." "Your service record does not say anything," he shot back. "It is a bunch of blacked-out lines and fancy stamps. Makes me think maybe you spend your deployments behind a desk somewhere, pushing papers and pretending to be a soldier." A few nervous laughs rippled through the formation. Cordelia remained silent. Huxley stepped closer. "I have seen your type before. Women who get assigned to combat units for political reasons, who get credit for things they never actually did. Is that what happened to you, Staff Sergeant? Did someone give you a participation trophy for showing up?" Cordelia felt the familiar heat of anger rising in her chest, but she had spent years learning to master that fire. She thought of her grandfather, who had faced far worse than insults and had responded with courage rather than rage. She thought of her father, who had taught her that discipline was the foundation of strength. "I served where I was assigned, Sergeant," she said evenly. "I did what was asked of me." Huxley snorted. "I bet you did." He turned away from her and addressed the company. "Let this be a lesson to all of you. There are soldiers who earn their place, and there are soldiers who have their place given to them. It is my job to figure out which is which." Cordelia returned to formation, her face betraying nothing. But inside, a memory surfaced unbidden. She was 24 years old, pinned behind a concrete barrier in a village whose name she would never forget. Her squad had been ambushed during what was supposed to be a routine patrol. The squad leader was dead. The radio operator was bleeding out. Enemy fire came from 3 directions, and reinforcements were 40 minutes away. She had taken command without thinking about it. She had directed suppressive fire, treated wounds with one hand while shooting with the other, and called in coordinates for air support using a dead man's radio. When the helicopters finally arrived, she had been the last one to board, covering the evacuation until every living soldier was safely aboard. The Silver Star citation described her actions in clinical language that captured none of the fear, none of the exhaustion, none of the weight of holding a dying friend's hand while bullets struck the wall above her head. It said nothing about the nightmares that still woke her sometimes, or the faces of the men she had killed to keep her people alive. Huxley knew none of this. He saw only what he wanted to see. That evening, Cordelia sat in the barracks common room, cleaning her weapon, when Private Fremont approached tentatively. "Staff Sergeant," the young woman said quietly, "I wanted to thank you again for the other day." Cordelia looked up and offered a small smile. "You do not need to thank me, Private. We'll look out for each other. That is how it is supposed to work." Fremont glanced around to make sure they were alone. "Can I ask you something?" "Go ahead." "How do you do it? How do you stay so calm when he is screaming at you like that?" "I feel like I'm going to shatter every time he looks at me." Cordelia considered the question carefully. She thought about all the things she could say, all the hard truths about fear and courage and the space between them. "I remember that his opinion of me does not change who I am," she said finally. "He can call me whatever he wants. He can believe whatever he wants. But he does not get to decide my worth. Only I get to do that." Fremont nodded slowly, absorbing the words. "I wish I could be like you." Cordelia shook her head. "You do not want to be like me, Private. You want to be like you, only stronger. And you will be. It just takes time." Across the base, in the administrative building, Sergeant Major Tobias Crenshaw was working late when a name on a transfer roster caught his eye. He read it once, then again, then reached for his phone before stopping himself. It cannot be the same family, could it? The fifth day brought a physical fitness assessment that would determine each soldier's qualification status for the quarter. Huxley announced it at morning formation with barely concealed anticipation, his eyes finding Cordelia in the ranks like a predator spotting wounded prey. "Today we separate the soldiers from the pretenders," he declared. "No hiding in the middle of the pack. No helping your friends limp across the finish line. Today you perform or you fail." The assessment began with push-ups, and Cordelia completed her set with mechanical precision. 72 repetitions before time was called, well above the maximum score threshold. Huxley watched from the sideline, his clipboard clutched tight enough to bend the metal clip. Sit-ups followed, then pull-ups, then a timed 2-meal run. At each station, Cordelia performed at a level that betrayed years of elite conditioning, the kind that came from training with units whose selection processes broke most candidates before they ever saw deployment. She tried to hold back, to score well without scoring remarkably, but her body knew only one way to perform under pressure. When the results were tallied, her numbers placed her in the top percentile of the entire battalion. Not just Bravo Company, the entire battalion. Huxley stared at the scores as if they had personally insulted him. 1,000 miles away, in a Pentagon office lined with photographs and commendations, General Marcus Ashworth Pemberton sat behind a desk that had once belonged to his Secretary of Defense. His aide knocked twice and entered with a tablet in hand. "Sir, there's a matter I thought you should be aware of," the aide said carefully. "It concerns your daughter." The general's expression did not change, but something shifted behind his eyes. "Is she hurt?" "No, sir. But her name has appeared in some unusual queries. Someone at Fort Whitfield has been attempting to access her classified service records. The requests have been denied, but they are persistent." General Ashworth Pemberton leaned back in his chair. "She asked me not to interfere," he said quietly. "She wanted to do this on her own." "I understand, sir. I just thought you should know." The general nodded slowly. "Keep monitoring, but take no action unless she requests it or unless the situation escalates beyond her control." The aide saluted and withdrew, leaving the general alone with the photograph on his desk. His daughter in combat gear, taken during her second deployment, smiling despite the exhaustion evident in her eyes. She had always been stubborn, just like her grandfather, just like him. Back at Fort Whitfield, the afternoon brought close-quarters combat training in the battalion gymnasium. Soldiers paired off to practice grappling techniques under the supervision of instructors, but Huxley had inserted himself into the rotation with unusual interest. "Ashworth Pemberton," he called out, "you scored remarkably well this morning. Let us see if your hand-to-hand skills match your running ability." Cordelia stepped onto the mat, knowing exactly what was about to happen. Huxley wanted to humiliate her in a way that numbers on a clipboard could not prevent. He wanted to put his hands on her and prove his dominance in front of the entire company. She could end this in seconds. She had trained with special operations units in techniques that were not taught in standard Army combatives courses. She knew how to disable an opponent before they realized they were in danger, how to apply pressure to joints and nerve clusters that would leave a man gasping on the ground. But using those skills would raise questions she could not answer. It would expose training that was supposed to remain hidden. So when Huxley shot for her legs, she let him take her down. When he mounted her position and pressed his forearm against her throat, she tapped out. The company watched in uncomfortable silence as their staff sergeant submitted to a man who outweighed her by 60 pounds and fought without any of the restraint the training was supposed to instill. Huxley stood over her, breathing hard, triumph radiating from every pore. "Not so impressive now, are you?" he said. Cordelia rose to her feet and brushed off her uniform. "Good technique, Sergeant." The words were delivered without sarcasm, without bitterness, and somehow that made Huxley angrier than any insult could have. He wanted her to fight back. He wanted her to give him a reason. Again, he demanded. They reset, and again she let him win. And again. Each time she could see the frustration building behind his eyes, the confusion at an opponent who would not engage, who absorbed his aggression like water swallowing stones. Specialist Hitchens watched from the edge of the mat, his fists clenched at his sides. Beside him, Private Fremont had tears streaming down her face. "Why does she not fight back?" Fremont whispered. "She could beat him. I know she could." Hitchens shook his head slowly. "Because she is smarter than he is. She knows that winning the fight would mean losing something more important." On the mat, Cordelia submitted for the 4th time and stood again. Her lip was bleeding where Huxley's elbow had connected, but her eyes remained calm, almost peaceful. Huxley stared at her, like she was a code he could not crack. "What is wrong with you?" he demanded quietly, too low for others to hear. "Why will you not break?" Cordelia met his gaze and said nothing. Some questions did not deserve answers. A week passed, and the atmosphere in Bravo Company grew heavier with each day. Soldiers who had once whispered about Huxley's cruelty now fell silent entirely, afraid that even speaking his name might draw his wrath. The only topic of quiet conversation was the staff sergeant who refused to bend. Cordelia had become something between a mystery and a legend among the junior enlisted. They watched her absorb punishment that would have broken anyone else. They saw her help struggling soldiers when no one was looking, offering quiet words of encouragement and practical advice that somehow always worked. They noticed that she never complained, never made excuses, never asked for special treatment despite the target on her back. Private Fremont had started to improve. Her run times dropped. Her confidence grew. She began to meet Huxley's eyes when he screamed at her, not with defiance, but with a steadiness that had not existed before. When other soldiers asked what changed, she simply said that someone had taught her that her worth was not determined by the people who tried to diminish it. Huxley noticed the change, and it infuriated him. The morning of the 8th day brought unexpected visitors to Fort Whitfield. A convoy of black vehicles rolled through the main gate, carrying a congressional delegation on a routine inspection tour. The base commander, Colonel Patricia Sunderland, personally escorted the politicians through carefully prepared facilities while sergeants scrambled to ensure every surface gleamed and every soldier performed flawlessly. Bravo Company was selected for a demonstration of combat readiness drills. Huxley received the news with a mixture of pride and anxiety. This was his chance to showcase his training methods to people who mattered, to prove that his approach produced results. He gathered the company in a gymnasium for final preparations, his voice carrying the sharp edge of a man who would accept nothing less than perfection. This afternoon we show these civilians what real soldiers look like, he announced. Anyone who embarrasses me will wish they had never been born. Is that understood? Yes, Sergeant. The company responded in unison. His eyes swept the formation and landed on Cordelia. You will be in the back row, Ashworth Pemberton. Try not to trip over your own feet. Cordelia nodded without expression. Yes, Sergeant. The demonstration went smoothly at first. Soldiers moved through formations with crisp precision, executed tactical maneuvers without hesitation, and presented the image of a well-oiled military machine. The congressional delegates nodded approvingly, while Colonel Sunderland smiled with carefully practiced diplomacy. Then came the marksmanship exhibition. Soldiers took turns at the firing line, engaging targets at various distances while the delegates watched from a safe observation area. Scores were respectable but unremarkable until Huxley, seeking to impress, decided to add an unscripted element. Staff Sergeant Ashworth Pemberton, he called out. Step forward and show our guests what you can do. Cordelia hesitated for just a moment. She understood what he was doing. He expected her to fail publicly, to embarrass herself in front of important observers, to finally give him the ammunition he needed to justify his treatment of her. She stepped to the firing line and accepted the rifle from the range officer. The targets were set at standard qualification distances. She could miss deliberately, preserve her anonymity, let Huxley have his moment of triumph. But something in her resisted that choice. These soldiers had watched her lose fight after fight. They had seen her accept abuse without response. They deserved to see that strength was not always loud. She raised the rifle, exhaled slowly, and began to fire. The first target snapped back, then the second, then the third. Her rounds found center mass with mechanical consistency, each shot placed exactly where she intended. She cleared the standard course in half the expected time with a perfect score. The range fell silent. Huxley's face cycled through confusion, disbelief, and barely contained rage. Colonel Sunderland stepped forward with interest visible in her expression. That was exceptional shooting, Staff Sergeant, the colonel said. Where did you train? Cordelia saved her weapon and turned to face the senior officer. Various assignments, ma'am. I have been fortunate to learn from skilled instructors. Colonel Sunderland studied her for a long moment, something flickering behind her eyes that might have been recognition. The name Ashworth Pemberton stirred a distant memory. A dinner at the Pentagon years ago, a general introducing his daughter who had just completed Ranger School. What is your full name, Staff Sergeant? The colonel asked quietly. Before Cordelia could answer, Huxley inserted himself between them. Ma'am, we should continue with the demonstration. The delegates are waiting. Colonel Sunderland held Cordelia's gaze for another heartbeat, then nodded slowly. Of course, Sergeant. Carry on. She walked away, but Cordelia saw her pull out her phone and begin typing. The colonel knew something or suspected something, and the walls Cordelia had built around her identity had just developed their first cracks. Huxley grabbed her arm as the company reformed, his grip tight enough to bruise. I do not know what game you are playing, he hissed, but I'm going to end it. The congressional delegation departed Fort Whitfield the following morning, but the ripples from Cordelia's marksmanship display continued to spread. Soldiers from other companies had heard about the staff sergeant in Bravo who shot like a special operations sniper. Rumors began to circulate about classified assignments and mysterious gaps in her service record. Huxley heard every whisper, and each one carved deeper into his pride. He had built his reputation on breaking soldiers, on being the man who could find weakness in anyone and exploit it until they shattered or submitted. Cordelia had done neither. She had absorbed everything he threw at her and somehow emerged stronger, her quiet resilience inspiring the very soldiers he was trying to control. On the morning of the 9th day, he found her alone in the equipment room conducting inventory. The door closed behind him with a sound that made Cordelia's instincts flare to high alert. We need to talk, Huxley said. Cordelia set down her clipboard and turned to face him. She positioned herself with her back to the wall and a clear path to the exit, movements so subtle that only someone with tactical training would recognize them. What can I do for you, Sergeant? Huxley stepped closer, using his size to dominate the small space. "You can start by telling me who you really are. I have been in this army for 12 years. I have seen every type of soldier there is, and I have never seen anyone like you." "I am exactly who my records say I am," Cordelia replied evenly. "Your records do not say anything," he snapped. "They are a wall of classified stamps and redacted pages. Nobody gets that kind of protection without connections." "So who is protecting you?" "Ashworth Pemberton. What politician or general did you impress to get your little secret file?" Cordelia felt the old anger stirring, but kept her voice calm. "I earned my record through service, Sergeant, the same way everyone else does." Huxley laughed, a harsh sound without humor. "Service? You want to talk about service? I have bled for this army. I have sweated and suffered and sacrificed while people like you coast through on special treatment and quotas. You do not belong here. Women do not belong in combat units. And they certainly do not belong standing in my formation acting like they are better than everyone else." "I have never acted like I am better than anyone," Cordelia said quietly. "You do not have to act it," he snarled. "It is in every breath you take, the way you move, the way you look at me like I am something beneath you. I see it every single day, and it makes me sick." He was close enough now that she could see the vein pulsing in his temple, could smell the coffee and rage on his breath. His hand came up and pressed against the wall beside her head, caging her in. "I'm going to give you one chance," he said softly. "Request a transfer. Get out of my company, get out of this battalion, and we forget any of this ever happened. Stay, and I promise you I will make every remaining day of your service a living hell." Cordelia met his eyes without flinching. "I'm not going anywhere, Sergeant." The words hung in the air between them like a declaration of war. Huxley's face contorted with fury. He pushed off the wall and paced the small room like a caged animal. "You think you are untouchable. You think because you have some fancy classified record that I cannot hurt you. But records can be changed. Incidents can be manufactured. I have friends in places you cannot even imagine. And when I am done with you, no one will remember your name except as a cautionary tale." "Are you threatening me, Sergeant?" "I'm making you a promise." He stopped pacing and stared at her with something that had moved beyond anger into territory that made Cordelia's combat instincts scream warnings. This was a man approaching his breaking point, a man who had built his entire identity on dominance and control. She represented everything he could not dominate, could not control, and that was driving him toward a precipice. "Then I suppose we understand each other," Cordelia said. She picked up her clipboard and walked toward the door. "I have inventory to complete." She was almost out when his voice stopped her cold. "I know about your father." Cordelia froze, her hand on the doorframe. Huxley's smile was visible in his voice. "Oh yes, I made some calls. Ashworth Pemberton is not a common name. And there's a general with that name sitting pretty at the Pentagon right now. Care to tell me about that, Staff Sergeant?" She turned slowly to face him. "My family is not relevant to my service. Your family is the only thing relevant," he shot back. "Daddy's little girl playing soldier while he pulls strings from Washington. That is what this is it not? That is why your record is untouchable. Because Daddy made sure his precious daughter would never face any real consequences." Cordelia felt something crack inside her, a fissure in the wall of discipline she had maintained for so long. But she sealed it before it could spread. "You do not know anything about me or my family," she said quietly. "And if you did, you would be afraid." She walked out before he could respond, her heart pounding against her ribs like a caged bird fighting for freedom. The parade ground stretched out under a cloudless Georgia sky, the morning sun casting sharp shadows across the assembled ranks of Bravo Company. It was the 10th day since Cordelia's arrival, and the tension that had been building between her and Huxley had reached a pressure that everyone could feel. Soldiers stood at attention in perfect rows, rifles held at their sides, eyes fixed forward. Cordelia took her position in the second rank, her body still and composed despite the exhaustion of another sleepless night. She had spent hours staring at the ceiling of her barracks room, replaying the confrontation in the equipment room, analyzing Huxley's words for weaknesses and threats. He knew about her father. That changed everything. Huxley emerged from the administrative building and strode toward the formation with an energy that made several soldiers visibly tense. There was something different about him today, a manic quality to his movements that suggested a man who had made a decision and was eager to see it through. "Company, attention," he barked. The soldiers snapped to rigid posture as one. Huxley walked the length of the formation slowly, savoring the fear he inspired. When he reached the center, he stopped and turned to face them. "Today we're going to conduct rifle drill," he announced. "And we're going to do it until every single one of you performs it perfectly. Anyone who makes a mistake will answer to me personally." The drill began, and the company moved through the familiar sequences with practice coordination. Present arms, order arms, right shoulder arms, left shoulder arms. The commands came faster and faster as Huxley pushed the pace beyond what was reasonable, waiting for someone to falter. Private Fremont was the first to stumble. Her rifle slipped during transition, the stock catching on her uniform for just a fraction of a second before she recovered. It was a minor error, barely noticeable, but Huxley descended on her like a hawk striking a mouse. "What was that, Private?" he screamed, his face inches from hers. "Did I just see you disrespect your weapon in my formation?" Fremont's face went pale. "No, Sergeant. I mean, yes, Sergeant. I apologize, Sergeant." "You apologize." Huxley's voice dripped with contempt. "You think an apology fixes incompetence. You think sorry brings back the soldier who dies because his battle buddy could not handle her rifle properly." Cordelia watched from her position, every muscle in her body fighting the urge to intervene. She had promised herself she would not make waves. She had sworn she would complete this assignment without incident, without using her family name or her connections. But watching Fremont tremble under Huxley's assault was becoming physically painful. "Maybe you need some personal instruction," Huxley continued. "Maybe I need to show you what happens when soldiers fail their duties." He grabbed the rifle from Fremont's hands and shoved her backward. She stumbled and fell, landing hard on the packed dirt of the parade ground. A gasp rippled through the formation, quickly suppressed. "Get up," Huxley ordered. "Get up and show me you are worth the uniform you are wearing." Fremont struggled to her feet, tears streaming down her face. Her hand was shaking so badly she could barely stand at attention. "Pathetic," Huxley spat. "Absolutely pathetic. This is what happens when we let weakness into our ranks. This is what happens when we lower standards to make people feel included." His eyes swept the formation and found Cordelia. "And this is what happens when certain soldiers think they can inspire others to believe they are more than they are." He walked toward her with deliberate steps, each footfall echoing across the silent parade ground. "Staff Sergeant Ashworth Pemberton," he said loudly, "you seem to have appointed yourself as some kind of mentor to the weaker members of this company. Perhaps you would like to demonstrate proper rifle drill for Private Fremont. Show her how it is done." Cordelia stepped forward from formation. "Of course, Sergeant." She executed the drill flawlessly, each movement precise and controlled, her rifle an extension of her body. Years of training flowed through muscle memory, the countless hours she had spent perfecting these fundamentals under instructors who accepted nothing less than excellence. Huxley watched with narrowed eyes. Again he commanded. She performed the sequence again. Perfect. Again. Perfect. His jaw tightened with each repetition, his frustration mounting as she refused to provide the failure he was seeking. "Faster," he demanded. She increased her speed without sacrificing precision. "Faster." Still perfect. Something snapped behind Huxley's eyes. He stepped directly into her space, close enough that his chest nearly touched her rifle. "You think you are better than me," he said quietly, his voice carrying just far enough for the nearest soldiers to hear. "You think your fancy record and your general daddy make you untouchable." Cordelia kept her eyes forward, her rifle steady. "I'm simply following orders, Sergeant. Following orders." He laughed bitterly. "Let me give you an order then. Put down your weapon." She hesitated for just a moment, her instincts screaming warnings. Then she lowered her rifle and stood at attention, unarmed and exposed. Huxley smiled. It was not a pleasant expression. "Now," he said softly, Let's see how perfect you really are." The parade ground seemed to hold its breath. Soldiers in formation stood frozen, their eyes fixed forward even as their peripheral vision tracked every movement between Huxley and the staff sergeant who had become the focal point of his obsession. Cordelia stood at attention without her rifle, hands at her sides, completely vulnerable. She knew what was coming. She had known since the moment she saw the look in his eyes that morning. Some part of her had always known it would end this way. "Your form is sloppy," Huxley announced loudly, circling her like a predator. "Your stance is wrong. Your shoulders are uneven. For someone with such an impressive classified record, you seem to have forgotten the basics." Every word was a lie, and everyone watching knew it. Her form was impeccable. Her stance was textbook perfect. But truth had never been the point. "Let me correct your posture," Huxley said. He stepped behind her and placed his hands on her shoulders, gripping hard enough to leave bruises. He wrenched her body to the left, then to the right, the movements violent and unnecessary. Cordelia did not resist. She absorbed the force and returned to her original position, her face betraying nothing. "Still wrong," Huxley growled. He moved to her front and stared at her with undisguised hatred. "You think you can outlast me? You think if you just keep taking it, eventually I will get tired and leave you alone. But I do not get tired, Staff Sergeant. I do not give up, and I do not lose to women who think they belong in my army." His hand shot out and grabbed her jaw, forcing her head to the side. She could feel his fingers digging into her skin, could smell the sweat and fury radiating from him. "Look at me when I'm talking to you," he snarled. She turned her eyes to meet his, and what he saw there made him flinch. There was no fear, no submission, just a calm, steady presence that seemed to look through him rather than at him. It was that look that broke him. His open palm connected with her face before conscious thought could intervene. The crack of impact echoed across the parade ground like a gunshot. Cordelia's head snapped to the side, and she stumbled, nearly falling before catching herself. Blood appeared at the corner of her mouth. The formation erupted in chaos. Soldiers broke ranks, shouting in disbelief. Private Fremont screamed. Specialist Hitchens surged forward but was grabbed by other soldiers who feared what Huxley might do next. Huxley stood over Cordelia, his chest heaving, his hands still raised. The reality of what he had done was beginning to penetrate the fog of rage, but he was too far gone to retreat. "Get up," he ordered, his voice cracking. "Get up and face me like a soldier." Cordelia rose slowly. She touched her lip and looked at the blood on her fingertips with an expression that might have been curiosity. Then she lifted her eyes to Huxley, and something in them had changed. The mask was gone. For the first time since arriving at Fort Whitfield, she let him see who she really was. Not the quiet staff sergeant trying to blend in, not the humble soldier avoiding attention. The woman who stood before him now had held a defensive position against overwhelming odds. She had killed enemy combatants at distances most snipers could not imagine. She had been forged in fires that would have reduced him to ash. Huxley took an involuntary step backward. Sergeant Major Crenshaw burst onto the parade ground at a dead run, his face ashen. He had been in the administrative building when a private came sprinting in with news of what was happening. He had been trying to reach Huxley for 2 days, ever since he confirmed whose daughter was serving in Bravo Company. He was too late. "Everyone stand down," Crenshaw bellowed. "Sergeant Huxley, step away from that soldier immediately." Huxley turned, confused by the sergeant major's tone. She was insubordinate. "I was correcting her behavior." "You just struck the daughter of General Marcus Ashworth Pemberton," Crenshaw said, his voice carrying across the now silent parade ground. "The Army Chief of Staff, and the granddaughter of Colonel Theodore Ashworth, Medal of Honor recipient." The color drained from Huxley's face. Crenshaw was not finished. Staff Sergeant Ashworth Pemberton holds a silver star, 2 bronze stars with valor, and a Purple Heart. Her service record is classified because she has conducted operations that you do not have clearance to know exist. And you just assaulted her in front of 50 witnesses. Huxley's mouth opened and closed, but no sound emerged. Crenshaw pulled out his phone. "Colonel Sunderland is already aware. She's making calls. If I were you, Sergeant, I would start praying. Cordelia stood motionless, blood still dripping from her lip, watching the man who had tormented her for 10 days finally understand the magnitude of his mistake. She felt no satisfaction, only a profound weariness and the knowledge that everything she had tried to build here was about to come crashing down. In the distance, she heard the first helicopter approaching. The helicopter touched down on the field adjacent to the parade ground, its rotors whipping dust and debris into spiraling clouds. Soldiers shielded their eyes as a figure emerged from the aircraft before the blades had even begun to slow. Colonel Vivian Thorne walked with the precision of a woman who had spent 30 years turning chaos into order. As the Inspector General's senior representative for the southeastern region, she had investigated everything from supply fraud to war crimes. Her presence at Fort Whitfield within 40 minutes of the incident spoke to channels of communication that operated far above normal military bureaucracy. She crossed the parade ground without acknowledging anyone except Sergeant Major Crenshaw, who fell in a step beside her and delivered a rapid summary of events. Her expression remained unchanged throughout, a mask of professional detachment that revealed nothing. "Where is the accused?" she asked. Crenshaw pointed to where Huxley stood, surrounded by a loose cordon of soldiers who seemed unsure whether they were guarding him or simply keeping their distance. "And Staff Sergeant Ashworth Pemberton. Still on the parade ground, ma'am." She refused medical attention until she could give her statement. Colonel Thorne's eyes found Cordelia standing apart from the chaos, blood drying on her chin, her posture still perfectly military despite everything. Something flickered across the colonel's face that might have been respect. A second helicopter appeared on the horizon before the first had fully powered down. This one carried Colonel Bernard Okonkwo from the Judge Advocate General's Corps, accompanied by 2 military police officers whose presence transformed the situation from an incident into a formal proceeding. Colonel Okonkwo was a tall man with silver hair and eyes that had seen too many careers end in rooms without windows. He carried a briefcase that contained the authority to detain, to charge, and to begin the process that would determine whether Sergeant First Class Randall Huxley would spend the next decade in military prison. The 2 colonels conferred briefly before approaching Huxley. "Sergeant First Class Huxley," Colonel Okonkwo began, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "You are being detained pending investigation of assault charges under Article 128 of the Uniform Code of Military Justice. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court-martial proceeding." Huxley's face had taken on a grayish pallor. "This is a misunderstanding," he stammered. "She provoked me. She was insubordinate, and I was simply maintaining discipline." Colonel Thorne stepped forward. "We have 53 witness statements being collected as we speak, Sergeant. I would advise you to exercise your right to silence until you have consulted with defense counsel." "You do not understand," Huxley insisted, his voice rising. "She is not who she claims to be. She has been undermining my authority since she arrived. Her father is a general, and she has been using that connection to make my life impossible." The colonels exchanged glances that communicated volumes. A third helicopter descended from the cloudless sky, and this one made Sergeant Major Crenshaw straighten visibly. The aircraft bore markings that identified it as belonging to base command, and the woman who stepped out was Colonel Patricia Sunderland herself. She walked directly to Cordelia, ignoring everyone else on the parade ground. The 2 women stood face to face for a long moment before Sunderland spoke. "Delia," she said softly, "I should have recognized you sooner. I met you at your father's promotion ceremony 8 years ago. You were just finishing Ranger School." Cordelia's composure cracked slightly. "I remember, ma'am. You told me my grandfather would have been proud. I meant it then. I mean it more now." Sunderland reached out and gently touched the bruise forming on Cordelia's cheek. "Will you let the medics look at you?" "After I give my statement, ma'am." Sunderland nodded with understanding. "Your father has been notified. He wanted to come himself, but I convinced him that his presence might complicate the legal proceedings. He asked me to tell you that he loves you and that he has never been prouder." For the first time since the assault, Cordelia's eyes glistened with moisture she refused to let fall. The fourth helicopter arrived, like punctuation at the end of sentence. Colonel Reginald Whitmore emerged with the quiet confidence of a man who had commanded special operations forces in theaters whose names were still classified. He wore no rank insignia beyond the eagle on his collar, but something in his bearing made every soldier on the parade ground instinctively straighten. He walked past the other colonels, past the military police, past Huxley, who had begun to visibly tremble. He stopped in front of Cordelia and snapped to attention. "Staff Sergeant Ashworth Pemberton," he said formally. "I served under your father during Operation Enduring Freedom, and I was present at Firebase Kogyani when you held the perimeter alone for 9 hours against 3 waves of enemy assault." Cordelia blinked. "You were on the extraction team." "I was, and I have told the story of what you did that day to every soldier I have trained since. It is an honor to see you again." He extended his hand, and after a moment of hesitation, Cordelia shook it. Behind them, Huxley made a sound that might have been a whimper. The man who had tormented her, who had called her a fraud and a pretender, was watching a special operations colonel treat her with the reverence usually reserved for living legends. The walls of his reality were crumbling, and there was nothing left to hold on to. Colonel Sunderland gathered the soldiers of Bravo Company into a formation facing the 4 colonels who now stood in a line before them. The military police had moved Huxley to the edge of the parade ground where he waited under guard, close enough to hear everything that was about to be said. Cordelia stood apart, a medic finally attending to her split lip while she watched the proceedings with quiet detachment. The adrenaline that had sustained her through the assault and its aftermath was beginning to fade, leaving behind an exhaustion that reached down to her bones. Colonel Sunderland stepped forward to address the assembled soldiers. "What you witnessed today was a criminal act," she began. "Sergeant First Class Huxley assaulted a fellow soldier in direct violation of military law and the basic principles of leadership. But before we proceed with the formal charges, I believe you deserve to know who it is that he attacked." She turned and gestured for Cordelia to join her. Cordelia hesitated, then walked forward on legs that felt strangely unsteady. Standing before the company that had watched her endure 10 days of torment felt different than she expected. She had spent so long hiding that the idea of being seen made her skin prickle with discomfort. "This is Staff Sergeant Cordelia Ashworth Pemberton," Sunderland continued. "Her father is General Marcus Ashworth Pemberton, the current Army Chief of Staff. Her grandfather was Colonel Theodore Ashworth, who received the Medal of Honor posthumously for actions in Vietnam that saved 6 members of his squad at the cost of his own life." Murmurs rippled through the formation. Soldiers who had wondered about the quiet staff sergeant with the classified record were beginning to understand the scope of their ignorance. "But her family legacy is not why we are here," Sunderland said firmly. "We are here because of what she herself has accomplished." Colonel Whitmore stepped forward, his special operations background lending weight to every word. "Staff Sergeant Ashworth Pemberton has completed 3 combat deployments to theaters I am not authorized to name. During her second deployment, her patrol was ambushed in hostile territory. The squad leader was killed instantly. The radio operator was critically wounded. Enemy forces had them surrounded from 3 directions." He paused, letting the silence build. Staff Sergeant Ashworth Pemberton assumed command. She coordinated suppressive fire, rendered medical aid under enemy contact, and called in air support using a dead man's radio. When evacuation helicopters arrived 40 minutes later, she was the last soldier to board, providing covering fire until every surviving member of her squad was safely extracted. Private Fremont had tears streaming down her face. Specialist Hitchens stood with his jaw clenched, fists tight at his sides. For those actions, Whitmore continued, she was awarded the Silver Star. It was her first major decoration, but not her last. Colonel Thorne took over, her voice crisp and precise. During her 3rd deployment, Staff Sergeant Ashworth Pemberton volunteered for a mission to extract intelligence assets from a compromised position. The operation encountered unexpected resistance. She held a defensive perimeter alone for 9 hours, through 3 waves of enemy assault, while wounded in the leg and shoulder. She is credited with 17 confirmed enemy kills during that engagement. She received her second Bronze Star with Valor Device for that action. The soldiers of Bravo Company stood in stunned silence. The woman they had watched submit to Huxley's abuse, who had let herself be thrown to the mat again and again in hand-to-hand training, had accomplished things most of them would never experience in their entire careers. Colonel Okonkwo addressed the formation next. Staff Sergeant Ashworth Pemberton requested assignment to Fort Whitfield specifically because she wanted to serve without the shadow of her family name. She asked that her record be kept confidential. She wanted to be judged on her own merits, not on her father's rank or her grandfather's sacrifice. He turned to look at Huxley, who seemed to have shrunk several inches since the colonels arrived. Sergeant First Class Huxley responded to her presence by launching a campaign of targeted harassment. He publicly humiliated her. He physically intimidated her. He threatened her career. And today, in front of 53 witnesses, he struck her across the face hard enough to draw blood. Huxley tried to speak, but the military police officer beside him placed a firm hand on his shoulder. Colonel Sunderland addressed the company one final time. Let this be a lesson to every soldier present. True strength does not announce itself. True courage does not seek recognition. Staff Sergeant Ashworth Pemberton could have ended this situation at any moment by revealing who she was. She could have had Sergeant Huxley removed with a single phone call. Instead, she chose to endure his abuse rather than compromise her principles or rely on privilege she had not earned here. She looked at Cordelia with something approaching reverence. That is the kind of soldier her grandfather was. That is the kind of leader her father is. And that is the kind of warrior she has proven herself to be long before any of us ever knew her name. Cordelia stood motionless, the weight of 50 gazes pressing against her like a physical force. She had never wanted this. She had never wanted recognition or praise or the burden of living up to legends. But standing there, with the blood drying on her lip and the bruise darkening on her cheek, she realized that some things could not be hidden forever. Some lights were too bright to keep under a bushel. Her grandfather had taught her that through the story of his sacrifice. Today, she had learned it for herself. Colonel Okonkwo turned to face Huxley with the measured calm of a man who had presided over hundreds of military justice proceedings. The JAG officer opened his briefcase and withdrew a folder that seemed impossibly thick for charges compiled in less than an hour. Sergeant First Class Randall Huxley, he began, his voice carrying across the silent parade ground. You are formally charged with assault consummated by battery under Article 128 of the Uniform Code of Military Justice. You are further charged with conduct unbecoming under Article 133, abuse of authority and creating a hostile command environment. Huxley's face had gone from gray to an almost translucent white. His lips moved but produced no sound. These charges carry a maximum sentence of 10 years confinement, dishonorable discharge, and forfeiture of all pay and allowances, Okonkwo continued. However, in light of additional evidence that has come to our attention, these charges represent only the beginning of your legal difficulties. Colonel Thorne stepped forward, her Inspector General credentials lending gravity to what came next. Over the past 3 hours, my office has received 17 formal complaints from soldiers who previously served under Sergeant Huxley. These complaints detail a pattern of physical intimidation, verbal abuse, and harassment spanning his entire career. Many of these soldiers attempted to report his behavior through proper channels but were discouraged or ignored. She opened her own folder and began reading names. Private First Class Angela Morrison, 2019. Complaint of excessive physical contact during training. Complaint buried by battalion commander. Specialist Jerome Washington, 2020. Filed harassment report after Huxley threatened to destroy his career. Washington was transferred to Alaska within 2 weeks. Sergeant Yolanda Freeman, 2021. Reported assault during field exercise. Her commanding officer at the time was Colonel Raymond Driscoll. The name hung in the air like smoke. Colonel Driscoll is currently under investigation for his role in suppressing these complaints, Thorne continued. His retirement, announced last month, has been placed on hold pending the outcome of our inquiry. Huxley found his voice at last. This is not fair, he croaked. I was doing my job. I was maintaining discipline. These soldiers were weak, and I was making them stronger. Colonel Whitmore moved to stand directly in front of him. I have trained soldiers in conditions you cannot imagine, Whitmore said quietly. I have pushed men and women to their absolute limits and beyond. And I have never, not once, needed to lay my hands on a soldier in anger to accomplish that mission. He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried to every ear on the parade ground. You're not a leader, Sergeant. You're a bully who found a uniform. And today that uniform comes off. The military police officers stepped forward with restraints. Huxley looked down at the handcuffs with an expression of disbelief, as if some part of him still could not accept that this was happening. You cannot do this, he said, his voice breaking. I have served 12 years. I have given everything to this army. Colonel Sunderland regarded him with something approaching pity. You have given nothing, she said. You have only taken. You took the confidence of soldiers who trusted you to develop them. You took the dignity of men and women who had no power to fight back. And today you try to take something from a soldier who had already given more than you could ever understand. She nodded to the MPs. Remove him. As they led Huxley away, his legs seemed to fail him. The MPs had to support his weight as they walked him toward the waiting vehicle. He looked back once, his eyes finding Cordelia in the crowd. And what she saw there was not hatred or defiance. It was the hollow gaze of a man watching his entire identity crumble to dust. Cordelia felt no satisfaction. She had known men like Huxley throughout her career, men whose sense of worth depended entirely on their power over others. When that power was stripped away, there was nothing left inside them. They were empty vessels that had mistaken cruelty for strength. Colonel Okonkwo approached her as the vehicle carrying Huxley disappeared through the main gate. Staff Sergeant, I want you to know that your testimony will be crucial to ensuring justice is served. Not just for yourself, but for all the soldiers he harmed over the years. Cordelia nodded slowly. I understand, sir. I will cooperate fully. He hesitated, then added in a softer tone. For what it is worth, your father would have every right to use his position to influence these proceedings. He has chosen not to. He said, and I quote, that his daughter has never needed anyone to fight her battles, and he was not going to start insulting her by suggesting otherwise. Despite everything, Cordelia felt a small smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. That sounds like him, she said quietly. The sun had begun its descent toward the Georgia pines, casting long shadows across the parade ground where so much had changed in a single day. Soldiers milled about in small groups, processing what they had witnessed. Some looked at Cordelia with awe, others with curiosity, a few with something that looked remarkably like hope. She had come to Fort Whitfield to escape her family shadow. Instead, she had cast a shadow of her own. The barracks common room was quiet that evening, most soldiers having retreated to their bunks to process the day's extraordinary events. Cordelia sat alone by the window, watching the last light fade from the sky, when footsteps announced she was no longer alone. Private Fremont stood in the doorway, hesitant but determined. May I sit with you, Staff Sergeant? Cordelia gestured to the chair across from her. Of course. Fremont settled into the seat and spent a long moment studying her hands before speaking. I wanted to thank you, not just for helping me that first day or for teaching me about my own worth. I wanted to thank you for showing me what real strength looks like. Cordelia shook her head gently. I did not do anything special, Private. I just refused to let one man's hatred change who I am. That is exactly what I mean. Fremont looked up with eyes that shimmered with emotion. You could have destroyed him at any moment. You could have made one phone call and had him removed before he ever laid a finger on you. But you did not. You took everything he threw at you because you wanted to prove something to yourself. That is the bravest thing I have ever seen. Before Cordelia could respond, Specialist Hitchens appeared in the doorway with several other soldiers from Bravo Company behind him. Hope we are not interrupting, he said. We just wanted to pay our respects. They filed into the common room one by one, young men and women who had watched her endure Huxley's abuse in silence. They stood in a loose semicircle, uncertain of protocol, but certain of their purpose. Staff Sergeant Hitchens said formally, "On behalf of Bravo Company, we want you to know that we see you. We see who you are and what you have done, and we are honored to serve alongside you." Cordelia rose to her feet, her throat tight with emotion she had not expected. "The honor is mine," she said softly. "Every single one of you showed up every day and faced a man who wanted to break you. That takes courage. Never let anyone tell you otherwise." The moment stretched between them, a connection forged in shared struggle and mutual respect. A knock at the door interrupted the gathering. Colonel Sunderland stood in the entrance, her expression warm despite the formality of her uniform. "I apologize for the intrusion," she said. "Staff Sergeant Ashworth Pemberton, may I have a word?" Cordelia followed her into the hallway, where the colonel spoke in low tones. "I've been in contact with several commands regarding your future assignment. Given what has happened, no one would blame you for requesting a transfer away from Fort Whitfield. But I want you to know that there is another option." Cordelia waited. Bravo Company needs new leadership, someone who can rebuild trust and show these soldiers what real command looks like. "I would like to recommend you for the position, if you're willing." The offer hung in the air between them. Cordelia thought about her original plan, her desire to serve anonymously, to prove herself without her family name clearing her path. That plan had failed, but perhaps something better had taken its place. "I have one request," she said finally. "Name it." "These soldiers need to know that leadership is not about fear. They need to see that discipline and respect can coexist. If I take this position, I want the authority to reshape this company from the ground up." Colonel Sunderland smiled. "That is exactly what I hoped you would say." Later that night, Cordelia sat on her bunk with her laptop open, the video call connecting to a familiar face half a world away. Her father appeared on screen, still in his office despite the late hour in Washington. His eyes went immediately to the bruise on her cheek, and she saw him struggle to control his reaction. "I'm fine, Dad," she said before he could speak. General Ashworth Pemberton exhaled slowly. "I know you are. That is what terrifies me sometimes. You're so much like your grandfather that it keeps me up at night." "Is that a compliment?" "It is the truth." He leaned closer to the camera. "I heard what you did. Not just today, but for the past 10 days. You had every reason to end that situation, and you chose not to. You chose to face it on your own terms. I needed to know I could," Cordelia admitted. "I needed to know that everything I have accomplished was mine. Not because of your name or grandfather's legacy." "Mine." Her father nodded slowly. "And now you know." "Now I know." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment before he spoke again. "Your mother wants you to call her tomorrow. She is worried sick, but did not want to interfere with your process, as she called it. Her restraint has been impressive." Cordelia laughed, the first genuine laughter she had felt in days. "I will call her first thing. I love you, Delia. I am proud of you. Not because of what you accomplished overseas or what you endured here. I am proud of you because of who you are. I love you too, Dad." She closed the laptop and lay back on her bunk, staring at the ceiling where shadows played in the dim light. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. She would face a company of soldiers who needed to be rebuilt, a legacy that could no longer be hidden, and a future that looked nothing like she had planned. But tonight, for the first time in longer than she could remember, she felt at peace. If this story moved you, we would love to hear from you. Drop a comment and share your favorite moment, or tell us about someone in your life who showed hidden strength when it mattered most. Your stories matter too, and we are grateful to share this time with you.